Everything we've discussed so far is part and parcel to international trade. Failure to reverse current trade policies threatens to reduce the profitability of independent cattle producers. The U.S. is the largest beef producer in the world, as well as the largest beef consumer. Despite this, we are a net importer of beef and cattle, and prior to the extraordinary BSE event that occurred in 2003, approximately 20% of all the available beef in the U.S. was imported beef or beef derived from imported cattle. You will recall that during the decade leading up to 2003, domestic cattle prices were severely depressed. Despite the fact that domestic beef consumption began increasing in 1994 and domestic beef demand strengthened significantly beginning in 1998, the conventional industry organizations explained that there were legitimate reasons why your cattle prices continued to remain low. They told you imports were not the problem. As they said, imports complement U.S. production. They do not compete with it. They also told you that the principal reason cattle prices remain low, remember we had $67 fat cattle in 2002, was your fault. You were producing too much beef on the hoof and you were oversupplying the market. So they said, if you want higher cattle prices, you have to go out and find more export markets. Does anyone not remember being told this when you asked why your cattle prices remained below the cost of production when beef demand was so strong? Well, what happened? In mid-2003, an extraordinary event occurred. Canada discovered BSE in its native cattle herd, and the U.S. closed its border to Canadian cattle and beef imports. United States cattle prices responded almost immediately, making what was perhaps the largest one-year jump in the history of our industry. Prices jumped nearly $18 per hundredweight for fat cattle. Then in 2004, after our export markets fell to a 19-year low, what happened to your cattle prices? They increased. I doubt that anyone watching this today would have predicted that outcome, particularly given how our industry was conditioned for years by USDA and NCBA to believe that our domestic cattle prices were almost exclusively dependent on exports. This important lesson doesn't mean that exports are not important, but it does mean that we clearly misunderstood how sensitive our cattle prices are to imports of live cattle and how important our domestic market is to our domestic cattle industry. This lesson tells us that if we don't incorporate provisions in trade agreements that reflect the supply-sensitive nature of our industry, then our industry will be vulnerable to any country that wishes to increase its cattle production to penetrate our market, and be vulnerable to any meat packer that wants to increase imports for the purpose of lowering domestic cattle prices. The International Trade Commission recently adopted the rule of thumb that for each 1% increase in fed cattle numbers, fed cattle prices would be expected to decrease by 2%. This shows us that our cattle industry is particularly sensitive to increased numbers of live cattle imports. And because neither the North American Free Trade Agreement nor any other trade agreement addresses this important fact, R-CALF USA continues to fight to include protections against import surges in all trade agreements. And we oppose trade agreements that do not contain such protections. Your membership in R-CALF USA will help us correct the deficiencies in our current trade policies.